Thank you very much for coming tonight to this event with photographer Andrew Winning and video journalist Inigo Gilmore. We're going to hear from them in a moment, but please, if you could first turn off your mobile phones. And when it comes to the Q&A session, if you could speak directly into the microphone, everyone will be able to hear you. So I'm just going to hand over to John D McHugh, who you may have seen here speak before. He's well known for his work in Afghanistan. He hasn't been out in Libya, but he has been working in Bahrain making a film. And he's a member of the Frontline Club and winner of the Frontline Club Award 2007. So I'm going to hand over to him for tonight.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all being here. It's lovely to see a full house at this event. It's been a complicated year, I think, for all of us. It's been a busy year. It's been a confusing year. I've been travelling quite a lot. I know you guys have been very busy. And it's great to have this opportunity to be here and try and get some an opportunity to drill down on some of what we've seen. The In the Picture event is usually focused on one photographer, but I think that it's really appropriate tonight that we have a photographer and a filmmaker or video journalist to help us get into some of the complexity of the story in Libya. Since the start of the Arab Spring, start of this year, my head's been in a bit of a spin, really. I've been all over the place, trying to keep track of, all over the place geographically, but trying to keep track of things. I ran off to Bahrain straight after the violence, and I was trying to keep track of what was happening, Twitter, as much as I could, following not just friends to see how they were doing, but trying to keep track of what was happening. And it was very difficult whilst trying to make a film myself. And in between that, getting various bits of tough news, hard news. People have had a bad time. Reporters, TV crews, photographers, people have been beaten, people have been subjected to sexual assault, people have been kidnapped or arrested, depending on your take, and held in horrible situations in contravention to not just the Geneva Convention, but also basic bloody human rights. We've also lost colleagues and friends. We all know what we're talking about, and I guess we'll get to that later. But it's been tough. So I think that tonight it's great to have the two guys, and I really what I want to do tonight is, with the discussion, we've got a staff photographer in Andrew Winning, and we've got a freelance filmmaker in Inigo. And a lot of the questions that I think we get to tonight, a lot of the topics, it's really going to be over and back, because we've got two different takes on the same experience. So what I'd like to do before we get started, what we're going to have is some photographs from Andrew, and then we're going to have some two separate pieces from Inigo on the work he's been doing. But before we look at anything, I'd just like to get a feel for what your experience has been, because I know, like I said, I was in a spin all year, but certainly, and tonight, at the start of all this, I went to Bahrain, and literally, as I arrived into Bahrain, I had friends who were in Egypt, I had friends who were in Bahrain who were leaving as I arrived, or as I eventually talked my way out of detention with the authorities at the airport. And then I had friends who were going back to Egypt, and then they were dashing up to the border to try and get into Libya. And we know sort of how it works and how confusing it can be, but I think it'd be really interesting to get both of your experiences. What happened? How did you both get to Libya? Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew. As a staff photographer, what's the process? How quickly did you find yourself in Libya from the first phone call?
I was asked to go in on a second rotation for our crew and to be part of the team coverage of what was going on in Libya, and to travel to Benghazi. I had several days to prepare to make sure that I was well equipped and flak jacket and security gear and all the rest of it. And then I flew to Cairo and then was driven the following morning all the way through into the night into Benghazi. We swapped cars at the border at Saloum, and then traveled through eastern Libya to Benghazi, arriving late the evening of the following day. And then I made brief contact with my colleagues who were there, who then shipped out the following morning, who I was replacing. And so it was fairly, it wasn't a rushed, it was a fairly structured and well-managed sort of changeover, if you like. I worked alongside sometimes another photographer or sometimes another journalist. We rotated frontline duty, with usually one day on and one day off. Frontline duty involved also having a security advisor who would help us measure the risk so we could stay safe insofar as it was possible, and basically to help us to stop if we were pushing the envelope too far.
I think I'm going to jump in there because I think we'll get further into what it was like on the ground. Okay. But I'm really interested just sort of that first initial blast, Inigo. Did you get a call?
Mine was completely different.
Were you calling other people?
It certainly wasn't managed, and it certainly wasn't with sort of security advisors. I'd actually been in Cairo for several weeks, for about 5 weeks, covering the Egyptian revolution, and you talked about jumping around all over the place, and it's been that kind of year where friends and colleagues have gone from one story to another, and it's just been this sort of eruption of stories across the Middle East, unprecedented really. And the Arab Spring has sprung all over the place, and it's just been trying to keep up with it. Where's the next thing going to pop up? So I was in Egypt, and while I was still in Egypt, I stayed on after Mubarak had gone to try and follow some characters that one of whom I made a film about for PBS Frontline. And it was during that time that there were the first signs of what was happening in Libya. I briefly came back to London just to remind myself how cold it was, and immediately thought, I've got to get back to the Middle East. And so I was literally here for a couple of days. I got back to Cairo, and because the only way to get into eastern Libya is to drive and drive and drive and drive. You drive for about 10 hours to the border, and then you sort of, it's a bit of a, when I first went in, it was kind of quite early on, it was a bit of a wing and a prayer job. You sort of get there, and the Egyptians sort of stamp you through, and then you get to the other side, and there's a couple of guys with guns and a book, and you sort of write your name and say, where are you going? Benghazi. And I'm like, well, good luck. Yeah. And we actually met this Polish journalist who was just wandering around in a sort of sort of no man's land between Egypt and Libya. And I said, are you lost? You're right. And I was traveling with a colleague. We were doing a piece for HDNet, which is a channel in the States that Dan Rather has now signed his name to, the great Dan Rather. And I'm going to show a clip from that later. And I'd never actually worked with them before, or with this colleague, but he was a great guy. He's a British guy. That we just sort of teamed up together and got commissioned to do this piece. And so we arrived at the border, and there we were, and we looked out the window, and there was a tribe-person guy, who was just a sort of Polish guy wandering around, like, where the hell are we? So we said, come with us, we'll give you a lift to Benghazi. And so it was kind of a bit like that. I mean, it was a bit ad hoc at the beginning, because obviously no one expected this to happen in Libya, and no one really knew how to handle it or what to do. And so the rebels were there, they were in control, they put their flag up, and they just said, good luck, on your way, sign the book, and see you later. And then we had a driver who we just literally met on the border, who had a decent enough car, it had 4 wheels, and said, can you take us to Benghazi? He said, sure. How much? We made a deal, and that was it, and we're on our way. So it was kind of fairly... and there was no security advisors. Yeah.
I'm quite envious because I spend a lot of my time embedded, and I have to fill out paperwork in endless reams and write your name and address 50 million different places. And I'd quite like once just to get off a plane, sign one book, and get stuck in. That's what a change.
That's border control, Neeson.
Right, we'll see some photographs first. I'm going to move back so you can see the pictures and not me. And I think, Andrew, you're going to just chat us through some of this as we go, or?
Yeah, just... Oh, watch out. You've got glass there. Yeah, this is a selection of photographs from the almost 3 weeks I was there, and really, I'll just show each one, and there's a few which illustrate perhaps the difficulties of working there, but this is near Brega. Friendly fire funeral. There's a firefight as far forward as the rebels were able to go when they were on their push towards the west. That was the first and so far only rebel oil shipment to leave Libya, which helped them finance their war.
Transitional camera.
It was a great effort by the rebels to try and make sure that everybody understood that they were not Al-Qaeda. So you can see a lot of those signs. It's the result of an airstrike when Ajdabiya was targeted, all the Gaddafi armor around Ajdabiya was hit on one night, and they began to withdraw very quickly towards the east, and this was the result of a munitions truck being hit. They're fairly improvised transport arrangements for getting to the front, both for fighters and journalists. And this is what you do when you start getting shot at, and they rather improvised retreat as well at the same time. And improvised headgear. And there's no age limit. They're a cheerful bunch. That's a typical rebel sort of armoured truck. It's another disorganised retreat.
How aware of the media were they, do you think? I mean, you said that there was a big effort made to, with the signs to show that they weren't Al-Qaeda. Did you have a lot of interaction? Did you feel?
Yeah, they were really happy to see us every day. They'd give us food. They were, literally shaking your hand. Everybody wanted to shake your hand. They were very, very grateful for our presence, and just wanted the world to know that they, wanted to get rid of their Gaddafi, basically. But they were very, very, very receptive to us. I didn't get a single ugly moment from anyone the whole time I was there.
And did you ever think that got a bit more difficult? Did you ever think that there was a message being pushed to you? You sort of, the framing has changed to trying to push you in a particular area or looking at a particular subject?
Not really, no. I think that you just had to. They were so enthusiastic they could keep flashing V signs at you. You got to the stage where you had to just stop taking pictures until they stopped flashing the V signs because it kept looking a bit ridiculous. And they only on a few occasions stopped us from moving towards the front because they would be trying to organise something, and there also became a time when they were trying to limit a lot of these sort of freelance civilians as well who were moving forward and basically getting in the way, and so they would put up checkpoints to stop them from advancing through as well. But no, there was really very little attempt to control what you could see or not see. There's none at all.
Was that your experience, Inigo? Did you ever feel that you were sort of being directed rather than just helped?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's so varied. It was very fluid, and partly depending on. Let me just come back over there.
Sure, come back. Come
back. I mean, it really depended a bit on the time frame and when it happened, because initially it was just no holds barred. They were just so happy for journalists to be there, and I guess part of it was that. The rebels were seeking credibility, and they wanted the world to know what they were going through. And for us to understand what had really happened during Gaddafi's regime, and I mean, the stories that came out were extraordinary. I mean, stuff that wasn't even documented by human rights groups over these years. People were telling me incredible stories, which I hadn't, I'd heard maybe small bits of, but had no idea of the scale of it. So when you arrived, they were just so happy that you were there, were delighted, and you were taken in and you were welcomed, and people were helping us out all the time, and young guys taking us to the front lines, giving their cars, their time. They were English. Many of them were English speaking. One of these young guys, I left Libya at one stage and then came back again after a few days. And when I came back, he'd disappeared, and his car had been found burnt out at the front lines, and his parents to this day don't know what's happened to him. He's either been captured and taken to Tripoli, or more likely he's probably dead. So people were just giving extraordinary time and energy and commitment to this revolution, because once they started it, they realized there was no turning back, because you know, Gaddafi was going to come after them. So, you know, so we were part of that process in the sense that, I guess, you know, by us being there, we gave them a sort of credibility in a sense, or at least were able to tell their stories, and that was very important for them.
And of course, they always want copies of the photographs afterwards as well.
Well, actually, because very few of them actually were on email or anything, so they didn't really have a concept of you know, email me a photograph. There's remarkably little internet compared, I think, to the experience. I wasn't in Egypt, but I think, you know, the prevalence of Twitter and Facebook as communication tools within the rebel movement really is just, it's not a factor at all in Libya.
Well, I think it was a bit. I mean, in terms of initially setting up the revolution, but obviously it was limited in terms of the numbers who were involved, and then from Gaddafi's side, he cut off a lot of the communications, so that obviously made it very difficult.
Yeah, and I saw exactly the same thing in Bahrain, where initially the information I could get was fairly free-flowing, and very sadly, you know, one of the characters in the film I made said at the end of the film, you know, we have to keep going as well. We're committed now. It's win or die, and he was absolutely right. But without being, you know, too light-hearted when I said it was on the photos, amazingly afterwards, I had suspicious people emailing me asking me for copies of photos, which I suspect were going to be used in military tribunals. And I also had people saying, I'm in that photograph. Can I have it? Try and balance this up. Anyway, Andrew, sorry, I interrupted again.
Sure, no, okay, it's fine. Again, this was a NATO airstrike on some Gaddafi vehicles. This came at a time when Gaddafi's troops changed their tactics and started moving around in vehicles very similar to the ones being used by the rebels to try, and they stopped using their heavy armour around the Brega and Ajdabia sort of sector of Libya, because every time they rolled out their armour, they'd been hit by NATO, so they switched to these light vehicles, which are essentially the same as what the rebels are using.
And then you get the Americans shooting up the wrong column when they...
Exactly. And you see the rebels there were trying to salvage bits of the guns from the burning car. So part of sort of improvised uniforms that the rebels wear.
Used to wear Ray-Bans, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll stick anything on the top of these trucks. That's actually from an aircraft, that missile launcher. You see what I mean about the V signs? Even an injured guy, he's just very keen for the V sign. It's a funeral for a helicopter pilot who had swapped sides, and Ajdabia was retaken for the second time. He flew several missions and eventually was shot down, and those are his sons. He was a popular man. A lot of people showed up to pay their respects. Refueling, Libya style. There's an improvised tripod. He put the boots on so that he wouldn't scratch the roof of his car. and he was lashing it to his car with the boot laces. Seems so as a breaks into a dance there.
As a staffer, I assume that you had the benefits of satellite technology and communications to transmit and...
Well, yeah, it was part of the remit. I mean, we basically had to file everything. Whenever you've got a set of pictures, you need to stop, and if it, so long as you're in a safe place, just start filing straight from the car. And the whole idea is to just keep the story rolling and the momentum rolling forward. And so, if you had more than 5 or 6 decent images, you'd stop, you'd file, and then you'd do it again and again and again, as for as long as the day would offer you images, and for as long as you had time to file.
And were you able to get feedback then from the editors back in London? I mean, did you get the famous sort of, have you got this AP you've got it?
No, fortunately that didn't happen very often. We were actually we had a very good momentum, so we were quite lucky in that respect. And the only feedback that my editor wanted from that was just to make sure that we were safe. So we would call in, we had a Thuraya to call in, essentially just for him to know that we were okay. And we'd call in every couple of hours, and a BGAN to file the pictures on. And that was, the feedback would come at the end of the day. You'd call in, and if there was any direction needed, then he'd offer it then. But there really wasn't a great deal. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward story. It's a big long road, and you just drive down it until you find some people in shooting, and then take pictures of them and withdraw and try not to get shot in the process, and send the pictures and carry on until you've had enough, basically, for the day.
But were you getting information then as to how things were changing? Because obviously if you guys didn't have, it was very difficult to follow what was happening, as you said, to try and keep track of where the front lines were. Were you getting lots of direction from the office? I've been in a situation where people in the office in London know far more about what's happening a mile down the road than I know.
No, there was very little attempt to micromanage our movements, and there was, I don't think there was any clearer, because usually we'd be travelling with the reporter who's updating the story. So the person who's updating the story that your editor's reading is sitting in the car with you. So you are producing the fresh information, and you're trying to stay as far toward, especially if we were covering the front line, you wanted to be as far forward as the rebels were, because the story was how far ahead they were or weren't. So if we were behind them, then we were sort of behind the curve, if you like. And the idea was to try and be as far forward as possible with them. And then on the days when you weren't doing frontline, you'd be perhaps a few kilometers behind, or all the way back to Ajdabia, covering people coming in who were injured, and fleshing out the story with content which wasn't strictly guys with guns, but perhaps injured people and other content, which all adds to the volume of images that people want to see, to be able to create a picture of what's going on.
So Inigo, Thuraya and BGAN as a freelancer, or just gossip with the Reuters car?
And I didn't even have that. I actually had this phone here, which is a little Nokia with a healthy crack right down the middle of it. And I stuck a little local SIM card in it and just hoped for the best. And most of the time it didn't work. But obviously I wasn't doing quite the same thing. I wasn't doing daily news. But we were still trying to stay in touch with people. And one of the biggest difficulties of covering this story was that you'd meet someone really interesting and they had a great story to tell, and you'd sort of arrange to meet them. They'd give you their local, what was called Libyana, as one of the networks there. You go, hey, take my Libyana number, take Libyana number. You'd try it. And sometimes after about 55 attempts, you might get through. And then there'd be some relative saying, sorry, he's at the front lines, he'll be back in God knows when. And so that was very difficult, because it was very hard to sustain a story and keep up with people. So no, I didn't have any Thuraya, I didn't have any BGAN, I didn't have any of the sort of technical nous that these chaps have, but I didn't really have very much at all, to be honest. But having said that, the media centre they created a media centre, which is kind of an amazing entity in itself in Benghazi. The rebels decided to create this media centre, and there were a couple of tech whizzes there who had come back from Canada and America, Libyans from the diaspora, and they set up this pretty amazing media centre with fairly high-speed internet. If there is such a thing, fairly high-speed internet. And we were able to get stuff out from there, but except for that, it was pretty hard.
Okay, Andrew, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Keep interrupting you.
No, that's good. It's a group of people from Chad. Gaddafi uses a lot of people from Chad as mercenaries, and these guys have been captured in Ashdabia. It wasn't clear whether or not they were mercenaries, and they were very afraid for their safety when they got caught. And eventually, after a bit of discussions and some tense moments, they were sort of reassured that they weren't going to get summarily executed, and they were driven off to Benghazi. But it was a bit tense for them for a while. And this is friends of a soldier who accidentally shot himself at the front line by resting his gun a little bit too hard on the ground. And in the first few days of my stay in Libya, a lot of the injuries were self-inflicted. A lot of bullets through feet, and people who had face burns from standing too close to RPGs going off, and this was happening all the time. And in fact, these pictured married up with another colleague who actually had the moment when the guy did himself in.
If I just jump in there, there's a colleague of mine that was talking to a rebel one day and sort of, how's it going? He was standing with him, sort of RPG like this, and suddenly it just sort of went off. There was a fair number of weapons, not as many as they wanted, and a lot of people came unarmed, but even the ones that did have some weapon didn't really know what they were doing with it. So that was a bit unnerving, to say the least.
It's quite frightening, though. I mean, I remember, and I've spent a lot of time around the military with guns, and there's good gun discipline normally, and as long as you see the finger on the outside of the trigger guard, you feel safe. But I went into Darfur a few years ago and basically went way out in the wilds, and I got stopped at this checkpoint, and there's these young 14, 15-year-old boys waving AK-47s around, and the scariest thing was I could see nobody had the finger on the guard. They were all on the triggers. All the safeties were off, and I thought there's a very, very good chance I'm going to get shot here. But it is quite frightening when you see people shooting off RPGs by accident.
Yeah, it became punishable by the military leaders on the rebel side to fire your guns into the air, because that first friendly fire incident actually turned out to be the result of some exuberant firing into the air, and that's why they were hit, because the aircraft thought that this was anti-aircraft fire directed at them, and so they came in and strafed that line of vehicles. And from then on in, anybody firing their gun in the air, if there was actually a former Libyan soldier there, they'd come up and they'd give him a hard time.
So how relaxed was your security advisor?
He was great, actually. He was very, very relaxed. Even under the most complicated situations, he was very relaxed. So yeah, no, he was very cool.
It's good when he's not relaxed. It's time to go.
Well, yeah, he made it clear when he wasn't relaxed anymore. Yeah. A little girl whose house got hit by a Grad rocket in Braga, and she was brought into Ashdabia Hospital with shrapnel wounds, and she'd lost 2 of her siblings in that incident. There's a wall with images of people who've been killed or disappeared under Gaddafi's leadership, including many who are from a prison massacre near Tripoli in 1986.
Abu Salim prison. Yeah, 1986. Yeah, there was a massacre, and about 1,200 Libyans were killed in the prison. And actually, in many ways, that was the people, the families involved with the people that died in that prison were at the vanguard of the revolution, because the lawyer that represented the families in Benghazi was arrested a couple of days before the revolution started, and that actually led to some of the initial protests and it's a kind of it's a sort of scar that hung over the whole revolution and inspired many of the families who were related to those people that died. And when you go to the court building, which is the centre of the kind of symbolic centre of the revolution in Benghazi, you see this mourning tent and all the pictures of the dead. And one of the things that struck me when I first got there was, how come they've got all these pictures up already of people who were killed in the early days of the revolution, but actually there were pictures of the dead from the Abu Salim massacre. So it was a major spur for a lot of what happened there.
It's just a little reminder that this bit of desert has been fought over before. These are the Second World War graves from the North Africa campaign between Rommel and Montgomery. So the rebel who was using a tank for recreational purposes is using it as a little pot den. The exuberant protests pretty much every day, and people came out. And that's the selection of pictures there.
Okay, and
pass over to Inigo.
I was about to interrupt you, so the last question on that was just what was your biggest hit? What got used the most, or what was there a particular subject that people seemed to catch people's attention or imagination? Or?
You know, I don't know in the end what got more polished every day. I think it also had a lot to do with the way the story slipped off. I think after about 10 days I was there. Pictures were getting used all the time and heavily when I was first there, and then it slipped inside. I can't remember what news event it was that took over from that, but it wasn't front and center on the news agenda after sort of into the second week. It was still used, but I don't think I can't think of a single picture that was that had more hits than anything else. There was a lot of it got used every day, so it was a sort of general feeding the machine, and because it gets used not just in print media but online and in slideshows, it's incredibly difficult to trace what actually is getting more view.
Okay, sorry, I've interrupted you so many times. We're behind schedule. So Inigo, can you tell us what you're going to show us?
I'm going to show two shortish pieces. One is a 10-minute piece which I filmed and reported on for a channel in the States called HDNet, which is now kind of linked to the great Dan Rather, and you'll hear his dulcet tones booming through the piece. And the second thing is a little sort of trailer that I cut when I left Libya with the idea to try and get a commission for a longer piece.
The road to rebel-controlled eastern Libya leads from Egypt, both literally and figuratively. We sent reporters Willem Marks and Inigo Gilmore into Libya to try and explain how this revolt differs from the others that have swept the region.
Libya, Libya, freedom!
They headed into Benghazi, Libya's suddenly famous second largest city, to meet the men and women who are rising to challenge Gaddafi's rule after more than 40 years of brutal suppression. For centuries, Benghazi has served as an important port for multiple empires. And if the citizens here have their way, it will be the birthplace of a new Libya. The reminders of Gaddafi's Libya are everywhere, and the people here are eager to be rid of them. We came across a bonfire fueled by little pamphlets. These are the notorious Green Books that outline Gaddafi's ruling philosophy. They were required reading for all Libyans. Wherever you look, there are signs of protest. Here, a tent becomes a gallery for handwritten pleas. And painted murals have sprung up that are far from subtle. In these respects, what is happening in Libya looks quite similar to what has taken place in other Arab countries. But then there are scenes like this. Welcome to basic training for the new rebel army. In a Benghazi schoolyard, the volunteer warriors get rudimentary instruction from trained officers who have recently defected from Gaddafi's Libyan army. It isn't hard to find those who are eager to fight, but there's a shortage of weapons and experienced military leaders. It's not easy to build an army overnight, and frustration levels are high. One young man we first met lining up in formation was eager to vent his impatience when the drill was over.
تناقشوا كيف نشيل الناس عزة كيف هذوما مجاهدين بالله عليك من غير سلاح. كيف نحطهم في أرض الميدان من غير سلاح من غير تخطيط حربي. وين القائد بتاعنا احنا حربي ولا القوات الحربية اللي عندنا وين؟
One of the staging areas for rebel troops heading to the front lines is a burnt-out building down by the port. There's a bleak irony to the fact that this is now a home base for the rebellion. Just a few weeks ago, it was the headquarters for Gaddafi's secret police. 30-year-old Nadir Mazik is from Benghazi, and he says everyone here feared this building as a place where people would be taken never to return.
The family, friend, very sad.
One of his friends died here, and he says now is the time for payback. A month ago, Mazik was a bodybuilding coach. Today, he wears a uniform and waits for his orders to head into battle. Inside the building, Mazik led us down to the charred basement in order to explain why he and so many others are determined to fight.
This room, look.
This, he said, was a torture chamber. The local population torched the place in anger when the rebellion began. Mazik recounted the horrors inflicted by the secret police in these rooms.
ايوه يفكوا مثلا في اطراف الاصابع تمام يستعمل مثلا في المخلاب هذا بتاع المسامير فهمت كيف يقطع في اللسانات يقطع مرات في الاذان اي حاجه يديروا فيها.
In another room, Mazik flipped through files that had survived the fire. He said they were records of prisoners held here, evidence of an institutionalized terror.
Very angry, and when I come in here, very angry, and I need kill the Gaddafi now, because for people, for dead people here.
There are few certainties about what is taking place in Libya now, but one thing is clear: many more people will die. Early one morning, we joined Mazik as he headed west to a town that the rebels had held the day before after a fierce fight.
I'm going to the Serbia because they're my brothers and friends, and after go fight to the Gaddafi in the Tripoli.
We passed a rebel army checkpoint on the edge of town. On the side of the road, a young fighter scanned the skies with an aged anti-aircraft gun. Traffic flowed normally inside the town, past portraits of Gaddafi that had been torn down from government buildings. Mazik took us to the local hospital, where he greeted a fellow soldier who says he was wounded by shrapnel.
Kids are in this room?
Yeah.
In the children's ward, two young brothers were being treated for head wounds they say were the result of ricocheting bullets shot by Gaddafi forces.
This is shoot him in the kids, in the head, in the face. Why? Why?
Their father sat in shock on the bed. The gunfire had claimed a third son's life. Next door to the hospital is the morgue. A van parked outside was full of bodies. including that of the third son. Mazik joined the crowd of mourners that had gathered in a mood that was both angry and sad. Many looking on were relatives of the dead.
And this man, father, is dead.
Mazik says the world needs to pay attention to every one of these deaths. Proof of Gaddafi's willingness to murder his own people. Back in Benghazi, a group of young men paint the old Libyan flag on a building downtown. It has become the emblem for the uprising. The flag is everywhere, and so are the colors: red, black, and green. For weeks now, the people of Benghazi have gathered every afternoon by the water in a show of solidarity. Not just men, but women and children. Lots of children. The atmosphere is part carnival, part political rally. The passion is unquestionable, but looming over everything here is a haunting question. Can all this emotion form the basis for a new country?
This is a scene that was never seen in Libya.
Essam Gariani is one of the senior advisors to the new so-called National Council, a provisional government that the rebels have just established in Benghazi.
It is different from any other Arab country. It is a country that had no institutions whatsoever, and that's what makes our revolution special, and that's what makes our task very difficult.
Gariani is popular with the young protesters. A psychologist by profession who trained at Michigan State University, he's become a respected elder statesman in a revolution that's only a few weeks old. Gariani has joined a small group of intellectuals who are busy drafting a new constitution. But first, they have to win the war, if they can, against Gaddafi.
The main and our utmost priority is the downfall of the regime. This is the most important thing for us now, in order to put an end to the bloodshed that is taking place in all the towns that he still has some partial control over.
So the bloody battles continue, and for now, no one can predict how this all will end. For the Gaddafi regime, for the thousands of rebel soldiers like Nadir Marzik, and for the men and women who hope to lead a new Libya. But in Benghazi, the feeling is that the risks they've taken are worth it.
You know what? I am so excited about what's happening in Libya, and I am so happy that I lived those past couple weeks, that even if I die tomorrow, I feel that I have lived the most enjoyable moments in my life in the past 2 weeks. Definitely.
Just lining up the second piece. Gariani pops up in the other one, and obviously, as you can tell from the time frame, talking about the previous 2 weeks, that was quite early on. It was like the first 2 weeks of the revolution. This one is a bit of a broader scope. It's quite a short little piece, which is a bit more quirky in a way. But you've got to love Dan Rather, especially their passion is unmistakable. Anyway, here's the next piece.
On March the 1st, 2011, I joined a small band of journalists heading for the rebel stronghold of Benghazi, now firmly in the sights of Gaddafi's forces. The Libyan dictator had made it clear that anyone who dared enter here would also be considered his enemy too. Here were some poorly equipped rebel forces taking on a mighty regime notorious for its bloody cruelty to anyone who dared defy it.
It
really was quite overwhelming when I first got in there. Just this incredible sense of just of people unburdening themselves, this kind of explosion of kind of freedom and almost joyousness that they were able to speak openly.
Outrageously, Gaddafi denounces his own people as rats and degenerates. The people I meet, housewives, school teachers, musicians, it's their voices, it's their bravery that compels me to stay.
Defectively sign up, buy your hands and put your hands up. Nobody can stop us, we will never give up. You can't reach defectively with no sacrifice. You can't win the war with no fight.
You don't drink, you don't sleep with girls, you don't take drugs. What kind of rapper are you?
We want to teach future for our children.
We are short on time. We don't have the time. We're racing against time.
You just hear crying, all these people that died, thousands of people dying.
We deserve to live in dignity and freedom. We are not asking for a lot.
They've opened their lives up to us, their houses to us. They've told their stories, and unfortunately, by telling those stories, they may now be at grave risk. Al Jazeera cameraman's been shot dead. It was like a sort of spasm of fear that went through all the journalists.
Gaddafi had said, after all, that journalists are the enemy.
It's just a matter of time, perhaps a few days, before Gaddafi's forces will besiege the city.
Every day, like lambs to the slaughter, hundreds of young recruits head to the front.
We're glad that the world had the chance to see what the Libyan people have been suffering over the past 42 years.
Now we leave those people behind to face a very, very uncertain and I fear a very nasty and perhaps quite bloody future.
Are you worried that Gaddafi still might come back?
Actually, if he came back, I'm dead. We're all going to die.
It's frighteningly familiar. Depressingly familiar, actually. Okay, we will. We're going to get on to questions and answers. We are a little bit behind schedule. My fault for interrupting. We're going to go on to questions and some answers, hopefully. I have lots of questions I want to ask, but we're here to answer your questions. I would ask with the Q&A. I've sat in here enough times and rolled my eyes as people have asked questions about f-stops and camera types and everything. If we can try and stay away from the geeky techie stuff, that would be wonderful. Unless you ask something that one of these guys jumps up, in which case I guess we'll go with it. And the other thing I would ask is, I think a lot of people have questions, so we can keep them fairly succinct. If somebody jumps up and makes a big political statement, I am going to interrupt them and ask for a question. So, have we got questions, or no? I don't get to mine in first. Okay. If you can wait till the microphone gets to you, and if you can tell us who you are, that would be great.
Hi, sorry, my question's very simple. I'm just wondering, throughout a lot of the photography and the video footage, loads of people had signs in English. I'm just wondering, what was the proportion of people that had signs in Arabic or English, and were you selectively choosing those messages because people back home could understand?
For the photography, I picked the signs in English or in French because I can understand them and I can read them. If I was to put a sign in Arabic, or even if it was in Spanish or in Portuguese, I'd have to provide a translation in the caption because it's in English, so that somebody who doesn't speak English can understand what's in there. I don't read Arabic, unfortunately, so I couldn't put Arabic signs in there unless I had somebody sitting next to me to say exactly what it said on the sign. So that's why I couldn't pick Arabic signs, but there were plenty of them.
I mean, I think there was what tended to happen was that I mentioned earlier the media centre, and actually a lot of these guys were very media savvy. Some of them lived in America and Britain and Canada, and some had actually come back quite recently. And they made an effort to put signs in English, and because they knew that we were there. And so there were signs that went up in English, and there are many people there who are very good English speakers. You know, people would come up to you in the street and just talk to you in English and welcome you to their home and so on. So it wasn't unusual. I mean, some people were making their own signs, some were a bit more organised. It's not the question of shying away from the Arabic signs. I think often the Arabic signs were more eloquent in a way, in some senses, but obviously in terms of imagery and so on, and with the audience you're trying to address, you're probably going to use the things that people are more likely to understand.
And I would say, having filmed in Bahrain during all of this, so not shooting for people back home here, but shooting for Al Jazeera, I still also had to be able to, and I don't speak Arabic, and I still had to be able to provide a translation of what was in the footage or in the stills. So yeah, you pick things that either someone could explain to you or you could read. I'm not going to get a question at all, am I?
Hello, my name's Jennifer. This is a question for Inigo. In the first film, you had somebody speaking who'd just been recruited to the rebel army.
Yeah.
Expressing
Che Guevara lookalike, yeah.
Expressing frustration at the lack of planning, the lack of strategy. And I wondered, first of all, how widespread that frustration at the sort of chaotic nature of the army was, and also because you were talking in the discussion about the lack of holding a front line, and so on, whether that has changed over time, whether the planning, whether the front line has got more organised.
I think it's changed marginally, but this has been a constant theme from the beginning. I mean, I think partly because simply no one ever imagined this was going to happen. You know, people rose up in Benghazi, and the Gaddafi forces that were there, which were mainly police, there wasn't so much army, either fled or disappeared or just immersed themselves in the local population. And so then you had, well, the rebels, you know, who are they? I mean, who are this group? And some came over from Gaddafi's side, some military guys came over with a bit more expertise in military matters. But the average guy, you know, they may have done a bit of army military training here and there, they may know how to handle a gun somewhat, but generally people didn't really know what they were doing. And it was quite interesting actually, because one of the clips which didn't make it into that piece, but were just after that, after he talked to us, some people came out and say, why are you saying this about how it's chaotic and, you know, we've got to stick together and all this kind of thing. But I mean, at the end of this military training, they didn't have a single gun to hand out to them. It was sort of, you know, a couple of clubs and stuff like that. So it was pretty chaotic. And then on a higher level, they created this military council. And this has been an ongoing problem. There have been two kind of military leaders who've claimed they're the military leader. And they've now had to bring in a third guy who's an older kind of statesman to preside over the two military leaders who say they're the military leader. So you've had that going on in Benghazi. You've had people on the front line with poor communications, getting different signals, different feedback. And then you've had, you know, the rebels often rushing headlong into battle, you know, albeit very bravely and with great passion and intent to overthrow this regime, but not really thinking about what they're doing, and suddenly having to retreat and then try and go back forward again. And you know, the bottom line really is that if NATO hadn't intervened, God knows what would be happening now. Probably Gaddafi forces would be in Benghazi, as they were when I was there. They came to the edge of the city essentially, and then the NATO bombing started. There is no real army to speak of. There's no real rebel army to speak of. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And the gains they've made have often been on the back of military of aerial strikes by NATO and then moving into those positions.
The back.
Don't let him ask any questions.
Yeah, Inigo, you take drugs, you party, why aren't you a rapper? Sorry, serious question.
I deny everything.
Sorry, my name's, maybe I shouldn't give my name after. Sean Lang, and I've worked a lot in the Middle East. I was just wondering, for both of you, and just quickly, I found it very powerful and very moving, both the photos and the film, but I'm just wondering, as journalists, who defines the terminology and how that feeds into the story? I've noticed, rebel army. So they're rebels. It's almost tantamount to freedom fighters. Which is, it's a close step there from rebel army, freedom fighters seem described as, and then short-term good guys. I remember in Afghanistan, today's insurgents and Taliban were during the Mujahideen days, they were freedom fighters, they were rebels, and in Afghanistan they were called rebels. And I don't know if anyone's seen footage. ITN was there, ITV, BBC. They were portrayed as friendly, lovable rogues, the good guys. Those same guys were then described as warlords, and then today's insurgents. In Iraq, when Inigo and I were there together, we couldn't use the word rebels. When I was in Fallujah and I saw women and children, and it's more than just a semantic term. Once you start using rebels, I noticed in your footage and your photographs, you're looking for the human side. When I filmed with the Taliban, and when I was in Iraq with the insurgents, I used to be criticized heavily if I ever over-humanized them. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. It's not a leading question, I'm genuinely...
Do you want to come up here, Sean?
Yeah,
sorry,
do better than you, mate.
Can I just ask Andrew? Inigo, can I just ask Andrew first, working for Reuters, are there any specific terms, when you caption these pictures, are there any specific rules as to how you describe rebels, insurgents, freedom fighters?
Well, you just don't use a loaded term. I think rebels are actually quite neutral, but...
It's never been used in any of the other Middle East as well.
Right, but we used rebels, and the text journalists used rebels to refer to the people who were rising up against Gaddafi because they were in rebellion, I suppose. But we don't use freedom fighters or the word terrorist unless it's a direct quote from somebody.
So that's the rule that's set down. You avoid those.
Try to avoid loaded terms when you're referring to people with guns.
But I was who sets down these rules? Because there's a difference between rebel and insurgent in Iraq.
They're set down usually by the editor who's handling the story, but I think the word terrorist it's a company-wide, unless it's as a quote from somebody using that word, it's not used. But we try to steer away from loaded terms.
I think, as with all these kind of stories, especially one not expected to happen, a sort of consensus develops, and consensus develops, and sort of terms get used. I actually can't remember what I used. Rebel, or was that Dan rather? I mean, it actually became an issue talking to some of the Libyans there. They're like, we're not rebels, we're freedom fighters. And then you're like, okay, but you're rebels, or you're freedom fighters, but you're rebelling against Gaddafi, and this did actually become a point of discussion. I guess the media is quite lazy sometimes, or perhaps just goes for a simple label, rebel, But some of the Libyans did resent it a bit. They saw themselves as freedom fighters. They're like, what are we rebelling against? We're not rebels against. We are Libyans. So what are we rebelling against? We never asked for this guy. You
didn't feel that a certain terminology was required of you, or something was that?
No, I mean, I kind of make it up as I go along usually. I had no problem. I would have no problem to call them freedom fighters or necessarily, but I got superseded by Dan Rather, who knows a lot more than me.
Inigo, will you turn that microphone around the other way, please?
Oh, is that what it is?
Yes.
What is this sound problems?
Do you mic up all your interviewees yourself?
Well, I try to. That's probably why there's so many sound problems, isn't there?
Right.
No, I don't think there was any cut and dry rule, and I think that but it's true, it did become an issue. Some of the Libyans there in Benghazi did raise that issue of what they were labelled as, and there was a concern about that, and there was also the other big concern was that they didn't want Gaddafi being accused in the east of having Al-Qaeda elements and so on and so forth, and this was the other big thing. So those two issues were major sources of discussion with them. To answer your question?
No, I didn't want to take that. No, because the American, we were very clearly, I wasn't worried so much about the Libyans appealing. It was very clear the Americans wouldn't allow the word rebel in Iraq because it has connotations of freedom fighters, good guys, for better.
Oh, I see.
And in Iraq, all the media complied, and we called them insurgents. And as a result, we started calling them insurgents. Then you show less girls crying and children, you show them as bad guys. And you were saying your race, in Iraq, you chose the word rebel. So that was
no, not in Iraq, in Libya.
Libya, but in Iraq.
In the text, that's what they were called.
Libya rebels. So that's my only point, was that we are slightly doing what we did in Afghanistan in Mujahideen, when they were rebels. Then they became bad guys. That was slightly.
So did you use the word insurgent?
Well, I didn't use the word.
Well, the difficulty now, of course, in Afghanistan is you try to keep up. Every time I go back, there's a different acronym. It's ACM was one year was anti-coalition militia, and you're making these films. And at the time I was making sort of 10-minute films for The Guardian, and each time you make a film, you're desperately trying to get in this acronym and then explain it, and then you go back next time. Oh, it's changed. It's AAF now. They're anti-Afghan forces. And you're like, oh God, start again.
It's laid down by.
Yeah, but I mean, I think actually people just, spend years writing doctorates on what the correct acronym can be and get promoted, and then somebody else writes another one.
I mean, I generally try and avoid it just by letting people tell their stories, and then people can work it out for themselves. I think it's good to avoid labels if you can.
Right, moving on.
Good evening. My question, like a lot of things, according to Sean, is not as long.
Sorry, who are you?
My name is Jonathan, I'm not a journalist, but in the film Mr. Geriani stated Libya is a different country from any other Arab country. My Libyan colleague and I are helping people who are deploying to Libya at the moment. What pearl of wisdom would you pass on that you didn't have available to you, that you could get from a Libyan, having this little bit of hindsight that you have now? Something from a Libyan about Libya.
That I didn't know about, you mean before I went there?
Yes, we can all perhaps try to prepare for what the places we go to. I've been to a few of the places in a slightly different capacity, and when I've got there, very often I've end up finding it very different to how I'd imagined, and I've been missing bits of preparation. What could a Libyan help you with by way of preparation before you go?
It's one of those conundrums, isn't it? I mean, there's a few things. One thing that struck me about Benghazi was that it's a very conservative place, and in many ways. And I just come from Cairo, where things are very mixed, or certainly mixed in comparison to some of the countries in the region. And I'd covered the revolution there, and men and women have been there together, mixing and walking around together, mixed together. And when you get to Benghazi, you find it quite segregated. And at the east, I haven't been to Tripoli, but in the east, it's quite a segregated society, quite a conservative society. And of course, it's important to be respectful of that and understand that. That's one thing that really struck me. And I think the other thing that really occurred to me was that, people are naturally hospitable, incredibly hospitable, and they went out of their way to help us. And one of the things that an abiding memory of all of this time was the unsolicited help that we got from people, because you know, essentially this is a country that's been cut off from the outside world. Yes, Gaddafi and his son said we're going to open the country up, and a lot of people, including our late great leader Tony Blair, bought into that and embraced that. But at the same time, there was only a few people that were really benefiting from that. And the people in the East, especially in Benghazi and other areas, always resented Gaddafi, and they felt he was a corrupt, immoral person. And they have a lot of integrity, they have a lot of passion for a better way of life. And I think if you respect them and where they're coming from, they will reach out to you and embrace you very warmly.
You know, I think the one abiding feeling that I took away from Libya, on top of their enormous warmth and generosity, was this enormous surge of optimism that there's everywhere, and it's you know, it's almost perhaps bordering on the blind in some instances, but it's enormous optimism, and it's a very powerful and intoxicating and infectious kind of optimism. And I think that's the one abiding thing I took away from it.
That's interesting because just going back to Bahrain, because it wasn't in Libya, but I came away from my Arab Spring experience with very different feeling to that, because I saw the exuberance and excitement of the youth that I was mostly filming and working with. And as I said, you know, the main character, who's just been sentenced to a year in prison for rising against the regime, said to me at the end of the film, you know, this time we win or die. But what was interesting was the older people that I tried to speak to didn't want to be on camera, and they kept saying, not yet, we have to wait till the regime comes down, it's not safe, we've been through this before. And I guess I'm a bit of an old curmudgeon myself, and I found myself thinking, you're right. And it was this really complicated thing of filming people who I was genuinely concerned about, and say that the main character Saeed, who I probably broke all journalistic rules, but I urged him to get out of Bahrain before the film aired, because I really was concerned for his safety. But I found, you know, for all the excitement and the exuberance and the belief that things were going to change, I thought it was very important to look at the older people who'd been through this system, like the father you had, the guy with the tear running down his face, who said it's important the world sees what we've lived through for 42 years, because they've been through it before and they know that it doesn't all come toppling down.
Yeah, well, there was still, for instance, at the press conferences that they would hold periodically, they'd make a sort of running request to all TV channels not to do cutaways of the people who were present, because many of them have family in the western part of Libya and didn't want to expose them to any kind of
I mean, just one point there on that is that, I mean, what struck me about covering Egypt and Libya is that the situation now is that in Egypt you have the military effectively running things, and while Mubarak and his cronies have been pushed out, nothing much has really changed. The same structures are in place, essentially. Whereas in Libya, the rebels or freedom fighters, or whatever we're going to want to call them, let's just say the people of the East who are against Gaddafi, they fundamentally want to change the country. They want to bring in a new way of doing things. They have a roadmap for what they say is genuine democracy, and they're very, very passionate about it. They really fundamentally want to uproot the Gaddafi regime and change the country fundamentally, and that struck me as a major and very interesting difference between what I've seen in Egypt and Libya. And I mean, you know, the first free, I saw the day the first free newspaper came out in independent newspaper came out in Libya. It was created in the press center there, and you know, this is the first time in 42 years that Libyans had a newspaper written by Libyans with freedom to write as they wanted. And those are extraordinary things, and the people are genuinely passionate about that. They fundamentally want to change their country, and I just got a sense that I believe them in their genuine intent in that regard.
I do want to ask a question here before we run out of time, but I'll make it quick. I'm interested in, I mean, I made reference earlier to the deaths of Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros. Sorry, my microphone on? Can you hear me? Was I mumbling? No. Hello?
Can we have the mic?
Has the microphone gone off completely, or is it back now?
It's okay now.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I said earlier I made reference to the losses of the war. We lost Tim Hetherington, Chris Hondros. Later on, we found about Anton Hammerl, and lots of other people have been wounded. It's been pretty tough out there. What sort of training have you guys had? I mean, talk maybe a little bit about your background, how much experience you have, but what sort of training have you had, whether it's first aid or hostile environment? And also I'm interested in, because I wasn't there, but I know various friends had to leave behind things like body armour, where normally they wouldn't travel without it, they couldn't bring it in. Just talk about how you were set up for it. But, and again, coming from different backgrounds, the staff photographer and the. Do you want to go for it?
I mean, for my part, I worked in several countries as a journalist and as a filmmaker before I ever did a hostile environment course. I think I've been in Iraq for about 3 years, and they said, in the Middle East for 3 years, and including the Iraq War. And I was working as a print journalist then, and the paper I was working for said, oh, maybe you should do a hostile environment course. So I was sent off to Hereford in the middle of nowhere and rolled around in a ditch for a few days with some ex-Special Forces guy, and I ended up challenging him over the things he was telling me, because actually I've seen all these things before. So it was a very strange thing. So I've just done one of these courses, which I'm not sure I got so much out of. I would say in those courses, the only real benefit, I would believe, is the medical side. And it's been a huge blow and very traumatic for all of us to lose some good friends and colleagues. Tim Hetherington, who I knew well, and Chris Hondros, who was with him, who was a fantastic photographer. Tim began life as a photojournalist and transitioned into a great filmmaker, and he headed to be pigeonholed, and did incredible work. And you may have seen his film Restrepo, which won many awards, spending a year in Afghanistan. And I'd seen him in Benghazi earlier during this story, and I'd just left, and then later on he went to Misrata, where he was killed with Chris. And then later, of course, as you mentioned, we discovered Anton had been killed. Some of us have been in communication with his family to try and find out what had happened to him, but he was already dead. But the Libyan authorities had covered that up. So it's been a horrendous time. It's been deeply traumatic, and obviously makes you think a lot about what you're doing. I don't think in those circumstances the issue of hostile environment or medical matters would have played a big part. I think there was a degree of just severe bad luck, certainly with the case of Tim, because he got hit with shrapnel and unfortunately bled to death. But it was just, the situation as it was in Misrata was very, very difficult. But of course it does make you think about all those things and how to protect yourself. One of the things that didn't come out strongly enough and was not condemned enough, I think, was that the Egyptian authorities took away almost every piece of body armour that anyone was bringing in through Cairo. And of course the only way to get into the east was through Cairo and then driving across. And I know of one TV network that spent £20,000 ferrying people back and forth just to trying to get flak jackets in, getting them taken and sending people back again. And most of us didn't have any body armour, which is kind of nuts, really, in a way. More body armour came in, and of course that then affected many things. And I don't think in the case of Chris or Tim it would have perhaps made a difference, but of course it made it more difficult to operate there in what were already very, very difficult circumstances. And just on that note, I mean, obviously, want to pay tribute to them. They were brilliant journalists, brilliant people, lovely friends. I mean, incredible friends, and it has been a huge, huge blow, and I think it's going to affect things for a while in terms of our business. And I think it should be a time for reflection and debate about what we do and the circumstances in which we do the things we do.
With regards to the course, I've done one of those courses as well, and I'd concur that I think the medical part of it is definitely the most valuable. I don't have quite as much experience in combat, but I think also the story in Libya evolved so dramatically, sometimes from one day to the next, that really what you saw on the first day really sometimes really didn't prepare for what happened to you the following day. It's a terrible shame what happened to Tim, who I met in Benghazi, and he was a charming man and a very talented filmmaker and photographer. I never had the pleasure to meet either Anton or Chris, but Chris was big friends with some of my best friends, and he's sorely missed as well. And with regards to kit, I think that I was fortunate and in that I was able to get through Egyptian customs with my flak jacket, but we've had to leave all of any flak jacket that's gone into Libya. We've left there for colleagues who've come in because we've had also several confiscated, and it's definitely something you can't really operate without.
You said to me earlier, before we started, you said you talked about not having lots of combat experience, sort of like maybe people like I have, but it's very sort of being embedded. It's one specific experience which just gets repeated again and again. But you said, and I thought it was very interesting. You said that in fact you thought it was probably beneficial to you that you hadn't sort of that experience, that working in Libya reminded you of working in Haiti.
Well, it's similar in that sense, in that it was really unbelievably haphazard and chaotic, and there was no structure to it, and the situation changed literally in the blink of an eye, and where you least expected it. It was not a structured front line, it wasn't a visible front line, it was something that was sometimes very difficult to perceive, and I think it's become a little bit more established now, but I still think it's still very, very chaotic and highly hazardous story to cover. I mean, everybody who covered the eastern side, everybody had close shaves. Every single person had close shaves. Photographers stuck behind, photographers who were lifted, who were taken to Tripoli, others who spent significant numbers of hours behind enemy lines, inside Gaddafi territory, and then managed to get out. There was a lot of defective ordnance that didn't go off, which would have created a lot of damage had it done. There was a lot of good luck as well. So,
okay, sorry. Take some more questions if we can, Flora. Okay.
It's a question for Inigo. I'm a little bit confused about the second film that you showed. Is that for a commission, or, and if it does get commissioned, are you going to go back and follow up the stories, or is it just like a little?
It was for the sort of trailer with the intention of getting a commission. That particular, they liked it very much, but at the moment they're not going for it. I mean, one of the things that happened actually quite early on is that a lot of the outlets that you might try and get commissions from as a freelancer were very, very nervous about commissioning because of the security implications, of course. And as we just discussed, the injuries and deaths of several colleagues have, of course, reinforced that. On a personal level, I haven't quite made up my mind about going back to Libya. I mean, I've found this recent experience incredibly traumatic personally, and actually hit a real dip recently after Tim and Chris and Anton were killed, and being at his funeral was very, very difficult, very, very difficult. So so in that respect, I'm not quite sure. I might be going back to Egypt on a possible film, but at the moment I haven't decided about Libya. Obviously there's different aspects to the Libyan story, some more risky than others. The situation in Misrata continues to be very volatile and very difficult, and that's where Tim and Chris were killed. In Benghazi things are more stable, but of course it remains a fluid situation. So in answer, yes, it was a trailer for a possible commission. That commission has not happened as such, but I still feel it's a very important story to cover, and if I can find a way to cover it without exposing myself to particular risk, then I might do that.
Andrew, how do you feel about going back? Any plans?
I haven't planned it. I would like to see the fruition of the story, but it's something I always have to measure with the particular moment, and make sure that my family are happy with my taking the risks.
is a tricky balance.
Yes. Any other questions? Oh.
Hello. Anyway, in both the photos and the videos, there were lots of children. What part do you think they played in the revolution? How was it explained to them when you talked to them? What did were they used as a tool, or were they actively part of it, as it were?
Apart from the little girl who was injured, where we had access to that hospital, so it wasn't really used as a tool. I was able to photograph what happened to her. But in the demonstrations, the kids were there and were decorated and holding signs, and were obviously part of the general effort to show the Eastern Libyan, shall we call it, effort to try and change their country, and so they were decorated to a certain extent and used to embellish the scenery so that we would take their pictures. I mean, it can be a bit gratuitous, I suppose. There were sometimes though where a particular picture or a particular sign, especially on a particular day, if there was pressure from the Libyans towards NATO to improve their bombing efforts or something, that particular sign might have helped illustrate that particular story, which was why I would have chosen it on that given day.
My general impression was that it was very spontaneous. I mean, there were organised. You saw a woman there who was speaking to camera in the second piece, a mother and then a student, and that was a women's rally that they organised, and they marched through Benghazi, and people were coming up to me spontaneously and telling me their stories and saying how they hated the regime and so on and so forth. There was no one around them prompting them. No. But of course, yes, it was organised to an extent. But people generally feel anger. They feel they despise what's happened to them. They want to change their lives, and they lost their fear of Gaddafi. They lost their fear by coming forward and speaking out, and that's a very powerful thing. They never had that chance before. Here are people, you imagine, they couldn't even go on the street and say anything like that before. And there they were walking down the street, young women, kids dressed up. I mean, this would have been impossible just a few weeks earlier. So it's a very powerful thing when you think about that. And yes, of course, there's a degree of coordination, but I don't think there was a coercion anyway. People genuinely hate the regime. They hate what Gaddafi's done to them. I mean, they've killed their brothers, their sisters, their uncles, their fathers, and they just want to be rid of him. And once they in the early days, stepped over that psychological barrier, there was no turning back, It was a group thing. And there were elements of Gaddafi still around, don't get me wrong, we had lots of incidents where people would pop out, but generally the population was behind it. And I think rather than saying, oh yeah, they were pushing to that, it actually just reflected those feelings.
Okay, I think Inigo's given us a perfect closing thought, so I'm going to say thank you to Inigo, thank you to Andrew. Thanks for showing us your material, but also give you the insights into what went on behind us. As always at the Frontline Club, this will continue in the bar.